Hi, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You're listening to Living the Wildlife, discussing all things related to vertebrate pest control as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, wildlife control consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife, where we teach people about technical aspects of vertebrate pest control. Hey, thanks for being on board here, and hope you had a great week. So I'm recording today, and we are looking to continue our study on Brodifacoum. We've done a presentation already on Brodifacoum. Well, this is part 2. I'm ultimately going to have 4 parts to this particular series, where we're doing a deep dive on this really toxic active ingredient used to control commensal rodents around structures. So I hope you'll stay tuned. If you're coming into this, each one kind of stands alone, but they also all combine together. So if you haven't gotten to the first presentation, you can certainly watch this one and then go back and watch the prior one. But each one of them can stand alone. Do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, and we'd love to get some comments for you. If you could comment on the show, we'd love to hear that. Also, you can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you, thoughts about the show, criticisms, perhaps you want a topic covered, or perhaps you know of someone who might want to be on the show. We'd love to hear from you. Again, that's wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Well, this week I want to just sort of spotlight one of the things that we sell at the store. These are cards that you can hold in your wallet. They're the size of a credit card, and they can be used to help show scale. Those of you who've been following my podcast know that I really am a big believer in taking quality photos in wildlife damage management area, and this way you can show scale and always carry it with you. I would assume you always have your wallet with you. Well, now you can have something with scale. It has inches and centimeters as well. And this particular one has a white side and a gray side. Typically, when you're doing photography, using a gray scale is going to give you a better white balance. But nevertheless, if you like the white, flip it over to the white side. If you like the gray, flip it over to the gray side. And that can be useful for scale for you, because especially when you're doing those macro shots. All right, well, enough of all that. Why don't we get started with our presentation today on Brodifacoum. So let me get that going here. All right, so we're at part 2. As you can call it, I've been a little hyperbolic here. I call it the nuclear weapon of registered. I have to put that in there, of course, registered rodenticides, because there obviously are things that are more toxic than this that aren't registered. But so we're just focusing here on Brodifacoum. So just to kind of put things into relationship with other rodenticide active ingredients, and again, my context is here with the United States. Of course, we have, broadly speaking, anticoagulants and non-anticoagulants, and as you can see, Brodifacoum fits into the second generation column of the anticoagulants. So second gens, as you probably know, or if not, let me remind you, second gens are extraordinarily more toxic than first generation anticoagulants. So much so that one feeding of baits treated with these anticoagulants in the second gen column is usually sufficient to kill most rodents. So it's that toxic. Where the first generation requires multiple feedings, not many, but a few more multiple feedings to get the toxic, to get the kill results. So Brodifacoum of the second gens really has some pretty powerful toxicity to it. So we're going to talk about some of that today. So one of the things with Brodifacoum is when the EPA is looking at testing of various rodenticides is that we have to think about safety of the applicator, for example. You may wonder, well, why do we have to wear gloves while we're wearing this? Well, part of that's going to be that you don't want to have some of that rodenticide transferred to your skin, and then if you bite your fingernails or perhaps eat some food, you're then going to be microdosing yourself, right? Well, that's certainly going to be part of it, but there's also some concern with some of these rodenticides is how absorbable are they through the skin. Now, we're obviously not going to be testing humans for this, so they do tests on rats, and here you find out that 3.2 milligrams per kilogram is enough to kill 50% of the rats. So it is absorbable through the skin. Now, I don't want you breaking the label, of course. The label tells you to wear gloves when you're handling it, of course. But for us, of course, a lot of the rodenticides that we're going to be encountering are already going to be in formulation form. So those are going to be really microscopic. So you'd have to work really, really hard to get poisoning through the skin. The point is we don't know what the long-term effects of micro exposures are. So be safe, but just letting you know that there is some evidence of it being toxic through the skin. You can see two different numbers there. Must have been two different studies that were done. It gets different results. It happens a lot in science. Well, can you breathe this rodenticide, this active ingredient? Is it toxic through the air? The answer is yes, it is. Here again, we have rat, and with a 3.0 milligrams per kilogram LD50 isn't sufficient to kill 50% of the population of treated rats. So again, not a whole lot. Doesn't take a lot of concentration there to kill a rat by inhalation. So as I tell people, don't huff your bait, right? So you want to be careful with this. Typically our baits are going to be already pre-pelletized and already in a wax block of some sort, so the risk of inhalation is extraordinarily low. What about for other non-targets, for example, like with fish? Well, if you read most of your labels, they're going to tell you keep the product away from water. A lot of the rodenticides that we're using, if not all of them, are going to be highly toxic to fish. So, and here you can see, here we have a 0.04 milligrams per liter is enough to kill 50% of the fish. So that's an extraordinarily small. So 4/100ths of a milligram, and remember, a milligram is 1/1,000,000th of a kilogram. In this case, we're dealing with a liter because we're dealing with what the concentration is in water, and this is enough to kill fish, 0.4 milligrams per liter. So microscopic ability here to kill fish. So keep your rodenticides away from water. Brodifacoum in the soil. One of the things, of course, when we're using a lot of rodenticides is does it leak into the soil, right? So a lot of times if you're dealing with bait stations, for example, you're going to have that powder. Well, what are you doing with that powder? Are you just dumping it on the ground? Are you putting it in a trash can? Are you putting it in a bag and disposing of it? Where is that going, and what kind of persistence does it have in the soil? Well, lethal concentration 50% in soil is duration time. How long does it last before it breaks down? Well, 150 days at 20 degrees centigrade. Now, you may recall 0 degrees centigrade is 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So 20 degrees is probably going to be somewhere around 50 degrees or so. And then, of course, look at how much longer Brodifacoum stays active in soil when it's down to 12 degrees centigrade. That's probably going to be somewhere around maybe 42, 45 degrees. That's going to be 298 days, almost a year that it's going to stay lethal in the soil. So in terms of duration time, because we want those rodenticides, of course, to break down. We want all pesticides to ultimately break down. So the persistence they would have in the soil, Brodifacoum can hang around a while if the soil is not warm. Now, what kind of toxicity does it have for rats? Well, what kind of symptoms would you be looking for? For example, if a Norway rat, that's a brown rat here, was dosed with Brodifacoum, and what they found, what it was, in terms of this research, 4 days after exposure. Now, what constituted an exposure? The rodent was fed one waxed bait block, and within 4 days, it had what's called increased crouching, increased lying down, increased curled position, and increased paralysis. So you can see the slow acting nature. So one of the ways anticoagulants have an impact on rodents is it begins to affect their ability to be active. So it tires them out, but which makes sense. They're bleeding a little bit more internally. They're just not feeling as well as they should be, and they're just going to get more logy until finally they expire. And in this case, death occurred in 7 days after the rat ate that waxed block. What's the effect of Brodifacoum on house mice? Now, in this particular study, they did a no-choice diet. Now, I may have recall, if you're following with me, a choice diet, a choice test is when the rodent has equal access to treated grain and untreated grain. Well, in this case, that's a no choice, so the house mice only could eat, if they were going to eat, they were only going to eat poison food. In this case, the first death occurred with these mice within day 4. So again, you had that delay effect, right? And then on the LT, lethal term, 50 was 6.4 days. So on average, mice lasted 6.4 days. But the maximum survival with a no-choice test was 14 days for males and 9 days for females. So if you think that something in the second-gen category is automatically going to kill rodents faster, that is not necessarily true. That's one. I think that's a myth that a lot of pest controllers out there believe. The research seems to suggest that you're only getting about 1 day faster, but you're using something that's extraordinarily, that's 5 to 10 times more toxic than first generation anticoagulants. So we want to be careful how we're advertising things. Now, what was the effect of Brodifacoum poisoning on house mice? Now, I've done a presentation on this particular research before from Frankova of crop protection in 2017. And what he found is they were feeding these house mice, and what they learned was after about 3 days of feeding, the mouse essentially stopped eating. And then you can see the black bar there, that shows the mortality, or the mortality rate. So you had all the mice were surviving on day 3, and then once you hit day 4, they started dying off until finally you got to essentially 0, although it's not completely 0. I think there's at least one mouse still alive at that point. But the concern is that one of the challenges with the anticoagulant baits, because the rodent is able to feed on it multiple times, that what happens is they get a higher toxic dose than what they actually need. Because remember, I told you with second-gen anticoagulants, 1 feeding is typically enough to kill the rodent. Well, the problem is that they don't start feeling the negative effects until day 3 or day 4. So what happens on day 2? They get another toxic dose. And if they come back on day 3, they get another toxic dose. So what they found was with Brodifacoum, there seems to be a dietary suppressant to it. So if the rodent is feeding on the anticoagulant, they get 2 or 3 days of feeding out of it, and then their appetite drops off dramatically. Not for every mouse, but many of them. And so what they found was 75%, that when the Brodifacoum treated mice consumed only 75% of the food than their untreated counterparts. So their diet drops off dramatically. They're probably not just feeling well, or there's some sort of suppressing capacity within exposure to Brodifacoum. Now, what this may mean is that Brodifacoum treated mice may not be carrying as much toxic material as we would have anticipated otherwise. But time will tell. But the point is that at least is some good news that there's at least that suppressing. You'll know that some rodenticides also have that suppressive capacity. Bromethylene, for example, is one, has what's called the stop feeding effect, that when a rodent reaches a toxic dose, they no longer feed on the bait, which is good news. So we have less chance of them overdosing themselves, right? So they're still probably going to overdose themselves with Brodifacoum, but they may not be overdosing themselves as much as we previously anticipated. So what is the biological half-life of Brodifacoum? What is biological half-life? Well, biological half-life means how long does it take for the organism to process that rodenticide to reach a level of 50% of the original exposure. For example, if the rodent took 1 milligram of Brodifacoum, how long would it be before that rodent's biological processes broke that down so that it'd only be 50% of the Brodifacoum left in their body. That's what biological half-life is. It's a way of averaging out what kind of persistence a rodenticide has in the organism. And why that's important is that what happens if another animal comes and eats the mouse? If the faster or the shorter the half-life, the less likely a secondary animal is going to get poisoned when they eat this animal that was originally poisoned, right? So primary poisoning is the first animal that ate the poison. Secondary poisoning is the animal that ate the poison. All right, hope you're following me with it. So warfarin, which is a first-generation anticoagulant, the biological half-life is about 15 hours. Pretty short. Bromethylin, 5.6 days. Difascinone, now bromethylin is a non-anticoagulant. Difascinone is a first-generation anticoagulant. The half-life is 15 to 20 days. Brodifacoum, the half-life is 120 days. Tells you how toxic and how persistent this is. So this is like I said, you're using a quote-unquote nuclear weapon when you're using Brodifacoum. And so you just need to understand what you're dealing with when you're having this. So if a rodent feeds on this and somehow survives, it's going to take 120 days for that Brodifacoum in their system to become half as much. Now, what happens if the mouse eats again in 30 days? Right? So you can see how persistent the Brodifacoum gets. So what happens if an owl eats that mouse? Now the mouse, whatever poison was in the mouse is now in the owl, and the owl is breaking it down. How long does it take to break down in the owl? And the owl doesn't need to get anywhere near a toxic dose, because even low levels of exposure is going to interfere with its flying ability. And when you're flying, small mistakes can have big consequences. All right. But that's a topic for another story. So 120 days, that's a long time with this particular product. So how does an animal get rid of it? How does it get out of its system? Well, I mentioned earlier that metabolism, or the animal's normal biological processes, typically break down rodenticides. But in this case, that's not really the case with Brodifacoum, that the animal typically excretes it, comes out in the colon, in the feces, rather than through some sort of metabolic breakdown. Now the question is, what happens if another animal eats the feces of the rodent that was excreting Brodifacoum? I'll let you think about that some more, right? This is kind of the rabbit hole you can go down into. Now, in terms of field studies, they showed a high level of success using Brodifacoum. Well, that makes sense given how toxic it is, right? Well, we shouldn't be surprised if you're getting control rates at 95 to 100%, okay? So even when you're in areas with stored crops and livestock, those are very difficult places to control rodents because of the abundance of food. So this is one reason why we need products like Brodifacoum, as toxic as they are, is because there are situations where we really need to pull out the big guns because of difficulty in managing rodents. Right? No matter what the animal rights protest industry and so-called animal activists try to convince you otherwise, sometimes you have to come in with the big guns in order to get the job done. Now, are we probably using some of the big guns more often than we should? And I would say, yeah, this is where we need to get wisdom, and realizing that sometimes pursuing the almighty dollar or just what's convenient is not always the best long-term solution. And so this is really a moral decision that we need to be struggling with on our own here. But so what happens is when we don't make good decisions, people then lobby to have very harsh and over-the-top restrictions done because people aren't being wise with the use of their particular products. So think about that. Is there evidence of Brodifacoum resistance? And the answer is, as far as 2016, that's the information I had as far as the EU is concerned. That's the European Union. None was located yet. However, in New Zealand, they began to discover some rodenticide resistance with Brodifacoum in 2022, and that's with roof rats. So what is the LD50 for? What is the LD50 for these rodents? Well, for males was 2.8 milligrams per kilogram, females 3.81 milligrams per kilogram. But in New Zealand, they had 6 to 8 times higher than prior published lethal levels. So it shows you how much how much more toxicant was required to kill those roof rats. Remember, folks, resistance doesn't mean proof. Resistance just means it's harder to kill them, not that it's impossible to kill them. Okay, so we don't need to think these are like super rats, they can eat anything and still survive. That's not true. Remember, for resistance, we just need to make it harder to control rodents. And then if it's harder to control them, sometimes they'll get wise to that particular rodenticide, and then they'll have what's called behavioral resistance, and they just stop eating it. So how lethal is Brodifacoum to non-targets? Well, with Canada geese, it only takes less than 1 milligram per kilogram to kill 50% of your Canada geese. That's amazing, right? House sparrow, it takes more than 6 milligrams per kilogram to kill a house sparrow with Brodifacoum. And then ring-necked pheasant, it only takes 10 milligrams per kilogram. So you can see how different species process Brodifacoum in different ways, where Canada geese are highly sensitive to Brodifacoum, where ring-necked pheasant are less sensitive to Brodifacoum poisoning. Now, we shouldn't be poisoning any of these animals with Brodifacoum, right? But just in terms of the concern for secondary poisoning or non-target poisoning, these often can act as guides for how other animals will interact with it. So still not a lot, but when you compare it to 0.75 milligrams, 10 milligrams is a whole lot more, right? But let's keep it at 0. Let's follow that label and be careful and judicious with our use of this particular product. And then lastly, we have an LD100. Now, if that's a new term for you, LD100 means what's the lethal dose for 100% of the test population. And so in terms of chickens, 10.5 milligrams was enough to kill all the chickens that were under the study, and all 4 died with death starting at day 6. Now, why is this important? Well, chickens sometimes eat mice, and so if you're doing poisoning with mice, is there a risk of the chickens that someone may be raising on that property? And the answer is yes, there is. So the chickens may eat mice that are just sort of staggering around. They may peck at those, and all of a sudden you're getting some exposure with Brodifacoum. And then, of course, there's always the risk of them eating the bait directly if we're not careful with how we're applying it and following that particular label. So is it wise to necessarily use Brodifacoum where chickens are around? I'm going to leave that. I'm going to say if you can use something else, I'm going to probably suggest that you do. But I don't want to say never is never, right? I don't want to say that. I just want to say let's be very cautious, and it should be maybe a last resort if someone has, and you need to have good conversations with your clients on that particular front. So I'll leave it at that. But I'd love to have your opinions on the subject. So perhaps you can reach out to me, of course, at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear your thoughts about the chicken question in Brodifacoum. Well, I hope you found this information helpful. You can certainly there's my email again and some contact information. And do subscribe to my podcast. I would appreciate it. And, of course, your comments, criticisms, suggestions. Would love to hear from you. Again, this is Living the Wildlife, where we give technical information on all aspects related to vertebrate pest control. Hope you enjoyed the show. And so why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Well, because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Living the Wildlife podcast. Vertebrate pest control is an inherently dangerous activity involving risk of bodily injury to you, others, and/or property. Vertebrate pest control also involves legal issues, so be sure to always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and/or other control methods when controlling pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their affiliates are not responsible for your use of the information provided here. Always consult a qualified and appropriate professional before employing the information provided.